Can a simple touch on the skin speak louder than 1,000 sentences? It often can. Not because touch is magic, but because the body is older than the persona. It is older than politeness, older than strategy, older than the careful social mask that keeps feelings acceptable and contained, before anyone dares to name desire, before admiration becomes confession. The unconscious begins to write its first drafts through gesture, a hand that lingers, a shoulder brushed as if by accident, a greeting that softens into warmth. These are not proofs, but they are symbols. And symbols, as Jung observed, are the native language of the psyche. They rise from depths the rational mind has not yet mapped, carrying emotional truth in a form that can be denied, even as it is enacted. In modern life, words are cheap and often rehearsed. Compliments can be borrowed, promises can be performed, intentions can be disguised behind humor or vagueness, but touch, when it is respectful, consensual, and emotionally coherent with the rest of a person, tends to betray what the mouth tries to keep ambiguous. Not always. Sometimes touch is merely habit, culture, friendliness, or clumsy social learning. Yet when attraction is genuine and emotionally charged, the body moves with a particular kind of gravity. It does not only seek contact, it seeks resonance. It searches for a bridge, a small permission to reduce distance, a signal that says, the space between us is safe enough to cross. This is where a woman's sovereignty becomes essential. Because the purpose of reading touch is not to decode men like puzzles and then surrender to whatever the clues suggest. The purpose is clarity, to see what is being offered, to sense whether it aligns with respect, to feel whether the energy is clean, and to decide consciously what is welcome. Jung's work was never a manual for romantic prediction. It was an invitation to individuation, the slow strengthening of the self until it no longer begs for certainty from signs. A woman who is anchored in her worth can observe touch without becoming addicted to interpretation. She can notice and still choose. She can feel warmth without forfeiting boundaries. She can recognize interest without confusing it for commitment. That is emotional power, not the ability to control another's desire, but the ability to remain whole in its presence. In the psyche's theater, attraction is rarely just attraction. It's also projection. A man does not only touch a woman's arm, he may be touching the image of the feminine within him, an anima he longs to integrate, a softness he has exiled, a vitality he believes she possesses. Likewise, a woman may feel a spark and mistake it for fate, when it might be her own unlived life calling through him. This is why Jungian insight matters here. It teaches that what feels certain can still be symbolic, and what feels intense can still be unfinished. Touch, then, becomes one more doorway into psychological truth, not a verdict, but a mirror. And yet, mirrors can be illuminating. There are patterns that repeat across cultures because the body tends to express care, curiosity, and desire in similar ways, especially when a man is trying to stay respectable while still inching closer to intimacy. The key is never to isolate a single gesture. One touch means little without the atmosphere around it. Does his posture open toward her, or does he touch while keeping emotional distance? Do his eyes meet hers with steadiness? Or does he use contact as a shortcut while avoiding real presence? Does he respect her response? Pausing, adjusting, backing off when she stiffens? Or does he push through subtle discomfort, as if her body were not speaking? The first place where this language often announces itself is the greeting. The initial moment when two worlds acknowledge each other. A handshake can be purely formal, a social seal with no deeper intention. But when interest is alive, the greeting often changes texture. The contact becomes warmer, the release slightly delayed, the distance reduced by a gentle lean. Sometimes a hand finds the upper arm or the shoulder, not to claim, but to anchor the moment, to prolong the connection by one quiet breath. The unconscious, always hungry for what feels meaningful, tries to hold the doorway open a fraction longer than etiquette requires. In Jungian terms, this is the psyche testing the symbol, asking whether closeness can exist safely here, whether the other will receive it. But here's the empowering truth. Reception is not obligation. A woman does not owe softness because a man offers warmth. She does not owe access because he hints at longing. She can meet a greeting with her own clarity, returning what feels right, withholding what feels premature, letting her body deliver the boundary before her voice even needs to. This is not coldness. It is self-respect made visible. It is the difference between being chosen and choosing. The world has trained too many women to become interpreters of male behavior while ignoring their own inner signals. A Jungian lens reverses that. The most important symbol is not his touch, but her response to it. Does her nervous system relax or brace? Does she feel seen or scanned? Does she feel safe or managed? In the quiet seconds of first contact, the shadow also appears. Not the dramatic shadow of villainy, but the ordinary shadow of unconscious motives, insecurity masking as charm, entitlement hiding inside playfulness, the need to dominate disguised as protection. That is why discernment must be tender and fierce at once. A respectful touch feels different from a possessive one. A sincere gesture does not rush her body into agreement. It does not treat her as a stage for his confidence. It arrives with humility, as if asking rather than taking. And if the body is the first storyteller, then consent is the first sacred grammar. Without it, every symbol becomes contamination. What follows from the greeting is often a gradual map, small points of contact that build familiarity, testing whether intimacy can deepen without breaking trust. The unconscious, Jung would say, moves toward wholeness, and connection can be one of its pathways. But wholeness is never achieved by abandoning the self. The true invitation in this exploration is not simply to recognize where a man tends to touch when he feels interest, but to recognize what awakens in a woman when she notices it. The aim is not to become more desirable, but more awake, not to chase confirmation, but to cultivate inner authority. Because in a world crowded with performance, the rarest attraction is not toward a body, but toward a woman who belongs to herself. As familiarity begins to breathe between two people, touch often migrates from formality to something quieter and more personal, not more invasive, but more intentional. One of the most common territories where this shift occurs is the arm, a place both symbolically and socially charged with meaning. The arm is strength without threat, closeness without possession. It is a bridge the unconscious favors when it wants to say, "I am here," without forcing an answer. In Jungian terms, this is the psyche negotiating intimacy through a symbol that remains acceptable to the conscious mind. It is closeness that can still be denied, yet deeply felt. When a man touches a woman's arm during conversation, it is rarely about the arm itself. It is about testing resonance. The gesture often arrives during shared laughter, during emphasis, during moments when emotional energy rises and seeks a physical outlet. The unconscious does not like to remain abstract for long. It looks for embodiment, and the arm, exposed yet neutral, becomes a canvas for that first translation of feeling into form. But again, the meaning does not live in the gesture alone. It lives in the rhythm, the repetition, the response. One brush may be accidental, several, aligned with warmth, presence, and attuned awareness, begin to form a pattern. This is where a woman's self-trust becomes crucial. Empowerment is not the absence of desire. It is the refusal to outsource meaning. A woman who knows herself does not rush to interpret touch as validation. She does not inflate it into promise, nor dismiss it out of fear. She observes it as information. Does the contact feel natural, unforced, respectful of her space? Does it dissolve easily when she subtly shifts away? Or does it persist despite her body's signals? The answer to these questions matters far more than whether the touch exists at all. Jung warned that projection thrives where consciousness is weak. when a woman is not anchored in her own emotional center. She may project intention onto gestures that were never meant to carry such weight. Awareness returns the power to its rightful place. The arm also carries archetypal meaning. It is associated with action, capability, and support. When touched with care, it can unconsciously evoke the idea of being accompanied, not led. There's a difference between a hand that rests briefly as punctuation and one that presses as claim. The former invites connection, the latter tests boundaries. A man who is emotionally present tends to adjust instinctively to the woman's response. If she stiffens, he softens. If she leans in, he remains steady rather than escalating. This responsiveness is not strategy, it is attunement. And attunement is one of the clearest indicators that attraction is not merely physical, but relational. As the dynamic deepens, another gesture often emerges, one that carries a more intimate symbolic charge. Contact with the lower back. This area is not neutral. It sits close to the body's center of gravity, near vulnerability, near the instinctive core. Touch here cannot be entirely unconscious, even when it appears spontaneous. It draws from a deeper impulse. In crowded rooms or moments of movement, a hand at the small of the back can appear justified, even polite. But justification is not the same as meaning. The psyche chooses its symbols carefully, and this one speaks of protection, guidance, and closeness that assumes trust. From a Jungian perspective, this gesture often arises when the masculine archetype seeks to enact its protective dimension, not dominance, but containment. The instinct is ancient, to create a safe perimeter, to signal presence without force. When this touch is genuine, it feels steady rather than possessive. It does not linger excessively, nor does it tighten. It is brief, grounding, and then released. The message is subtle but potent. I am aware of you. I am oriented toward you. Yet, here, too. Discernment is essential. Protection that ignores consent is not protection. It is control wearing a softer mask. A woman's body will usually know the difference before her mind does. Female empowerment does not require rejecting such gestures outright, nor does it require accepting them to be polite. It requires listening inward. Does the contact create a sense of ease, or does it trigger alertness? Does it feel like inclusion? Or, like management, Jung emphasized that the body is a site of symbolic intelligence. Sensations are not random. They are messages from the unconscious. When a woman learns to trust those messages, she no longer needs external confirmation to justify her boundaries. She can step slightly aside, slow her pace, or meet the gesture with neutral stillness, allowing the dynamic to recalibrate. The way a man responds to that recalibration reveals far more than the touch itself. This is also where the shadow enters more clearly. For some men, touch becomes a way to bypass emotional risk. It can function as a shortcut, creating the illusion of intimacy without the vulnerability of disclosure. A hand at the back can replace a difficult conversation. An arm touched repeatedly can stand in for curiosity about her inner life. Jung would recognize this as inflation, the psyche reaching for symbolic union without the labor of consciousness. A woman who is awake to this pattern does not shame it, but she does not collude with it either. She notices whether touch is paired with presence, listening, and respect, or whether it floats alone, disconnected from real engagement. As contact moves closer to the center of the body, the stakes rise not because closeness is dangerous, but because meaning intensifies. The question is never simply, what does this touch mean? The deeper inquiry is, what is being invited, and am I willing to enter individuation? Jung taught, is the art of responding rather than reacting. It is the capacity to remain oneself while encountering another. In the language of touch, this means staying rooted even as intimacy approaches, allowing connection without collapse, and recognizing that the most important relationship in the room is always the one a woman has with her own inner authority. As intimacy continues to unfold, attention naturally shifts to the hands, those ancient instruments of offering and recognition. Across cultures and epochs, hands have carried symbolic weight far beyond their practical use. They bless, They build, they shield, they reach. In Jungian psychology, the hand is a mediator between inner intention and outer reality, the point where psyche becomes action. When a man feels genuine emotional attraction, his hands often begin to speak before his voice dares to follow. They search, hesitate, hover, and sometimes make contact in ways that appear casual but are anything but empty. A brief brush of fingers while passing an object, a momentary touch to the forearm that lasts just long enough to register. The subtle alignment of palms during shared laughter, these gestures form a quiet vocabulary. They are not declarations. They are inquiries. Each one asks a silent question. Is this welcome? Is this safe? Is there room for more? The power of these moments does not lie in their intensity, but in their vulnerability. Hands, unlike shoulders or backs, are exposed. To reach with them is to risk being seen. This is why men who are emotionally invested often become more careful with their hands, not less. They slow down, they wait for feedback, they listen with their skin. From the perspective of female empowerment, this is a crucial terrain. A woman who understands the symbolic language of hands does not confuse eagerness with depth. She notices whether contact is accompanied by attuned awareness or by restless seeking. Does his hand withdraw gracefully when she does not reciprocate, or does it persist? As if entitlement were hiding behind charm, Jung wrote that true relatedness requires the ego to tolerate uncertainty. When a man can allow his hand to remain open rather than grasping, it suggests a psyche capable of relationship rather than conquest. Hand contact also carries the theme of reciprocity. Unlike a guiding touch on the back, which can be one-directional, the hands invite mutuality. When fingers meet, both parties feel it equally. This symmetry makes the moment psychologically charged. It is here that projection can either dissolve or intensify. If a woman is not grounded, she may feel swept into significance too quickly, mistaking sensation for meaning. But when she is anchored in self-awareness, she can experience the warmth of contact without surrendering her center. She can let the moment exist without rushing to define it. This is not detachment, it is maturity. As attraction matures, touch sometimes takes on a lighter, more playful quality. These gestures are often dismissed as trivial. But in psychological terms, play is anything but shallow. Jung viewed play as a space where the psyche experiments with new forms without the pressure of permanence. It is a liminal zone, a threshold where seriousness and freedom coexist. When a man begins to introduce playful touches, a gentle nudge, a mock adjustment of clothing, a teasing brush of the shoulder, he is often testing whether intimacy can be joyful rather than heavy, whether closeness can unfold without fear. Playful touch, when healthy, is not about control. It is about shared rhythm. It arises when both nervous systems feel safe enough to relax. Laughter opens the body. Humor softens defenses. In these moments, touch becomes an extension of delight rather than desire alone. Yet, even here, discernment matters. Play can be a bridge, but it can also be a mask. Some use humor to avoid depth, to keep everything light so nothing real is ever at stake. The empowered response is not to reject play, but to notice whether it is balanced by moments of stillness, listening, and emotional presence. Throughout all these stages, the most important factor remains the same: the woman's relationship to herself. Jung's concept of individuation emphasizes the integration of instinct and consciousness in the realm of attraction. This means allowing the body to feel without letting it decide alone. Sensation provides data, the psyche provides context. When a woman honors both, she becomes less reactive and more discerning. She can enjoy closeness without losing clarity. She can welcome interest without making it her compass. Touch, in its authentic form, is never about persuasion. It is about resonance. It does not push, it invites. It does not confuse, it clarifies. And when it is aligned with respect, It leaves a woman feeling more herself, not less. This is perhaps the most reliable measure of all. Any gesture that diminishes self-trust, that creates anxiety or self-doubt, is not a sign of genuine interest, regardless of how romantic it appears. The psyche recognizes nourishment as expansion, not contraction. As the body speaks through these subtle languages, the invitation is not to decode every signal obsessively, but to refine perception, to notice patterns rather than isolated moments, to sense whether touch is supported by integrity, consistency, and emotional availability. Jung believed that the unconscious seeks wholeness, not intensity, in relationships. This means moving toward connections that support growth rather than distraction. When touch aligns with this movement, it becomes a quiet ally. When it does not, it becomes noise. In the end, the hands, the arms, the back. The playful gestures all are fragments of a larger story. They point not only to attraction, but to the quality of consciousness behind it, and for the woman who is willing to listen deeply. They offer insight without demanding surrender. She remains the author of her own experience, meeting touch not as a mystery to be solved, but as a dialogue in which her voice matters just as much. As these subtle exchanges accumulate, something larger begins to reveal itself, not in any single gesture, but in the coherence between them. Jung often emphasized that psychological truth is not found in isolated symbols, but in patterns that repeat with meaning. A man's touch, when aligned across time and context, forms a constellation. It either points toward presence, respect, and emotional availability, or toward fragmentation, impulse, and unresolved shadow. The body, unlike the persona, cannot sustain contradiction for long. Eventually, its language becomes consistent, and it is in this consistency that clarity emerges for a woman who has cultivated inner authority. This clarity does not provoke urgency. It invites choice. She is no longer scanning gestures for reassurance or decoding contact as proof of worth. She understands that attraction is not an achievement, but an experience, something that arises between two people when their inner worlds recognize each other without force. Jung would describe this as a moment of symbolic alignment, where projection begins to give way to genuine encounter. It is rare not because desire is rare, but because consciousness is. The empowered woman does not measure herself by how often she is touched, nor by how intensely. She measures resonance by how she feels afterward. Does she feel more grounded, more lucid, more at ease in her body, or does she feel restless, preoccupied, subtly diminished? These questions cut through romantic mythology and return attention to lived reality. The unconscious, when listened to, is not dramatic. It is precise. It speaks through sensation, mood, and intuition, offering guidance long before the intellect catches up. Jung taught that individuation requires a dialogue between the conscious and unconscious, a willingness to listen without being ruled in the realm of intimacy. This means allowing touch to be information, not instruction. A man's gestures may reveal interest, but they do not define destiny. They may signal longing, but they do not guarantee depth. When a woman understands this, she is liberated from the exhausting task of interpretation. She no longer asks, "What does this mean about me?" She asks, "What does this invite, and do I accept?" This shift is subtle but transformative. It moves the center of gravity from external validation to internal alignment. Touch becomes something to experience rather than analyze, something to respond to rather than anticipate. And in this space, the shadow loses its grip. The urge to romanticize, to rush, to fill silence with fantasy begins to soften. What remains is presence, the ability to stay with what is, without inflating it into what one hopes it might become. In healthy connection, touch evolves alongside communication. It does not replace it. A man who is emotionally available does not rely on gestures to do the work his words avoid. His touch complements his curiosity, his listening, his willingness to be known. Jung would see this as integration, instinct and consciousness moving together rather than at odds. When touch is integrated in this way, it feels clean. There's no aftertaste of confusion, no lingering question about intention. Even uncertainty feels honest. Conversely, when touch is abundant but clarity is scarce, the psyche becomes unsettled. The body may feel stimulated, but the deeper self remains hungry. This is the signal to pause, not to accuse, not to withdraw in fear, but to recenter. A woman who honors this signal is practicing emotional sovereignty. She is choosing herself not as defense, but as foundation. She understands that intimacy without truth is not intimacy at all, but a performance that slowly erodes self-trust. At the heart of this understanding lies a profound reorientation of power. Power is no longer located in being desired, but in discerning desire, not in being chosen, but in choosing wisely. Jung believed that the ultimate task of psychological growth is to become who one is, rather than who one is expected to be. In relationships, this means allowing attraction to unfold without sacrificing authenticity. It means letting the body speak, but not letting it override the wisdom of the whole psyche. When a man's touch is genuine, it does not demand acceleration. It does not create pressure to reciprocate before readiness. It leaves space for reflection, for curiosity, for mutual discovery. It respects the mystery of the other rather than trying to resolve it. And in that respect, it mirrors the deepest principle of individuation, that wholeness cannot be forced, only invited. As this exploration comes to a close, the essential lesson remains simple yet demanding. Touch is a language, but it is not a verdict. It reveals inclination, not intention. It offers a glimpse into the unconscious, not a map of the future. To read it well requires not hypervigilance, but presence, not cynicism, but self-knowledge. When a woman stands firmly in her own center, she can meet touch with openness and discernment, warmth and clarity, without losing herself in the process. In a world saturated with noise, the body still tells the truth quietly. It whispers rather than shouts. Those who learn to listen without abandoning themselves gain access not only to the mysteries of attraction, but to the deeper work of becoming whole. This is the gift Jung offered through his psychology, not certainty, but consciousness, not answers, but the capacity to live the questions with dignity and grace. If this reflection resonated, consider supporting the channel by liking, sharing, subscribing, and leaving a comment about what you've noticed in your own experiences of connection and self-awareness. Your engagement helps keep these conversations alive and evolving.